I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
It was a Tuesday in January, the kind of day New York decides it's actually the Arctic Circle. By noon, the wind was howling down West 35th Street with enough teeth to bite through a wool overcoat. The snow was coming down in sheets that made the view of the street from the office window look like a blurred photograph of a ghost town. Inside the brownstone, things were, as usual, under control. Fritz was in the kitchen coaxing something aromatic out of a copper pot, and upstairs in the plant rooms, Nero Wolfe was spending his 9 to 11 shift with the orchids, blissfully ignored by the weather. I was at my desk, catching up on the bank statements and wondering if I should suggest to Wolfe that we invest in a snowblower, though I knew the answer would be a grunt that translated to hire a man with a shovel. The disruption started at 10:40. It wasn't a phone call or a visitor with an appointment. It was the doorbell, followed by a frantic pounding that sounded like a drummer losing a fight with his kit. I went to the hall, checked the chain, and opened the door. A man tumbled in, accompanied by a blast of freezing air and about 10 pounds of fresh powder. He looked like a snowman that had been partially melted and then reassembled in a hurry. He was middle-aged, wearing a cashmere coat that had seen better days, specifically the days before he decided to roll in a snowbank, and clutching a leather attaché case as if it were the only thing keeping him on the planet. I must see Mr. Wolfe," he wheezed, shivering so hard I could hear his teeth rattling. "It's a matter of life and death. Not mine, perhaps, but certainly the death of a legacy." "Mr. Wolfe is with his orchids," I said, helping him out of the soggy cashmere. "He doesn't see people without an appointment, and he doesn't see them at all until after 11. You're early and damp. Why don't you have a seat in the front room while I see if Fritz can spare some coffee?" "No time," the man gasped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet-lined box. He opened it to reveal a gold watch, old and heavy, with a crest on the back I didn't recognize. "Give him this. Tell him it belongs to Peter Vance's son. He'll know the name." I took the watch. It looked like the kind of thing you'd find in a museum or the pocket of a man who owned at least one railroad. I left the snowman in the hallway and went to the office to wait for the elevator. When the clock struck 11, the elevator groaned and Wolfe emerged. He crossed to his desk with his usual monumental dignity, adjusted his bulk into the chair that was built to handle it, and sighed. It was the sigh of a man who had just left paradise for the mundane reality of work. "Archie." "Why is there a draft in the hallway?" "That would be Mr. Julian Vance," I said, placing the gold watch on his desk. "He says he's the son of Peter Vance. He arrived in a blizzard, looking like a discarded holiday decoration. He claims a legacy is dying." Wolfe didn't touch the watch. He watched it for a long, silent minute, his eyes narrowing. I knew that look. It wasn't interesting, exactly. It was a memory being retrieved from a very deep file. "Peter Vance," Wolfe murmured. His voice was a low rumble that seemed to vibrate on the floorboards. The man who believed that honor was a tangible asset. "He died 20 years ago, Archie, in Montenegro. He was a fool, but a principled one. Well, the sun is in the hall and he's currently vibrating. Do we let him in, or do I tell him the Arctic expedition is over?" Wolfe leaned back, his interlaced fingers resting on the expanse of his yellow waistcoat. "A legacy is dying." A dramatic phrase, but Julian Vance was never known for subtlety. "Bring him in. And Archie, tell Fritz we shall need more than coffee. If Julian is here, the weather is the least of our problems." I went back to the hall. Julian Vance was standing exactly where I'd left him, staring at the closed office door with an expression of pure dread. "The doctor will see you now," I said, "but leave the snow on the rug. Fritz just cleaned it." As I led him into the office, I noticed something I'd missed in the hallway. He wasn't just shivering from the cold. He was looking over his shoulder, checking the empty hallway as if he expected the blizzard itself to follow him in with a warrant. The sanctuary of the brownstone had just been breached, and for once Wolfe hadn't even grumbled about the dampness. He was too busy looking at the watch and the ghost of Peter Vance it represented. The transition from the icy silence of the street to the heavy atmosphere of the office was like moving from a refrigerator into a pressure cooker. Julian Vance didn't just sit in the red leather chair, he collapsed into it, looking as though the mere act of reaching West 35th Street had depleted his life's reserves. He was still clutching that attaché case against his chest, his knuckles white against the dark leather. Wolfe, meanwhile, had reached the stage of his mourning where he was ready to be annoyed. He sat perfectly still, his eyes travelling from the gold watch to the damp, shivering figure of our guest. "You are Julian Vance," Wolfe stated, not as a question but as an accusation. "The last I heard of you, you were involved in a rather tedious dispute over timber rights in Oregon. Why have you brought your father's watch into my house?" Vance swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the heavy office door, as if he expected it to be kicked in at any moment. "It's not just the watch, Mr. Wolfe, it's the vault. My father left a private repository in Zurich, something even the estate executors didn't know about. I finally got access last month. Inside was a ledger, a record of certain arrangements made during the final years of the war. Names, dates, and account numbers that were supposed to have been scrubbed from history." Wolfe's eyelids flickered. This was high-grade fuel. History, specifically the kind that people tried to bury under several tons of official silence, was one of his few non-botanical interests. "Arrangements, Mr. Vance? That is a comfortably vague term. It's a list of beneficiaries," Vance whispered, leaning forward. "People who profited from the displacement of assets in 1945. Some of them are still very much alive, and those who don't have descendants who currently sit on the boards of half the banks in this city." I made the mistake of trying to verify the first few names. I thought I was being discreet. I was wrong. I was standing by the window, watching the snow pile up against the glass. "And I suppose these beneficiaries aren't the types to send a thank-you note. You looked like you were being chased by a pack of wolves. And I don't mean the four-legged kind." "I've been followed since I landed at JFK," Vance said, his voice trembling. "Two men in a black sedan. They tried to run me off the road near Tarrytown. I managed to lose them in the storm, but they know I'm in the city. They know I have the ledger. Mr. Wolfe, I didn't know where to go. My father always said that if the world turned into a pack of lies, you were the only man who could afford the truth." Wolfe grunted. He hates being told what his duty are, especially when they involve taking in a man who brings a blizzard and a conspiracy into his front hall. "You are suggesting that because your father was a principled fool, I must become a sanctuary for his son's lack of caution? I am not a fortress." "I can pay," Vance said quickly, reaching for the attaché case. "I do not lack for money," Wolfe snapped. "I lack peace. By entering this house, you have invited your pursuers to focus their attention on my doorstep. Archie, go to the front. Is there a vehicle?" I moved back to the hall, eased the front door open just a crack, and peered out into the white chaos. The visibility was down to 20 feet, but even through the drifting snow, I could see the dull glimmer of headlights about half a block away. A heavy car was idling near a hydrant, its engine breathing out a steady plume of exhaust that the wind whipped away instantly. They were there, all right, waiting for the snowman to return. "We have company," I reported, returning to the office. "A black sedan is playing sentry. They aren't even trying to be subtle. They're just waiting for the thaw." Wolfe's jaw tightened. The sanctity of the brownstone had officially been compromised. It's one thing to have a client, it's another to have a siege. He looked at Julian Vance, then at the gold watch, and finally at the attaché case. The decision was being forced on him, and Wolfe hates nothing more than being forced. "Archie, put Mr. Vance in the south room on the third floor. Tell Fritz he will be staying for lunch and perhaps for dinner. He is to remain away from the windows." And Archie, Wolfe's eyes were like two pieces of cold flint. "If those men at the curb decide to test the lock, you are authorized to inform them of our policy regarding uninvited guests." "The policy involving the police, or the policy involving my right hook?" I asked. "The policy involves discretion," Wolfe said, though I knew he meant whatever was necessary to keep the draft out. As I led Julian Vance upstairs, the house felt different. The quiet, orderly rhythm of the brownstone had been replaced by a low-frequency hum of tension. Vance was practically hugging the attaché case, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. I settled him into the south room, which was comfortable enough for a man running for his life, and headed back down to the kitchen. Fritz was already adjusting the menu, his face set in that look of professional resignation he wears whenever a guest arrives without 48 hours' notice. "A ledger of ghosts, Fritz," I said, leaning against the counter, "and a black car in the snow. "It's going to be a long afternoon. The lamb will be ready at 1, Fritz replied, his focus never wavering from the stove. Ghost or no ghost, a man must eat. I went back to the office to find Wolfe staring at the snow. He wasn't reading, he was thinking, which is a much more dangerous activity for everyone else involved. The sanctuary was besieged, the suspects were circling, and for the first time in a month, Nero Wolfe looked like he was actually interested in something other than his orchids. The game was afoot, even if it was currently buried in 6 inches of powder. The black sedan didn't stay alone for long. By 2 o'clock, the snow had tapered off just enough to reveal a small parade of misery arriving at our door. It seemed Julian Vance hadn't been quite as discreet as he thought, or perhaps the ledger he carried was a homing beacon for the desperate. One by one they arrived, the beneficiaries of the ghosts Vance had dug up in Zurich. I ushered them into the front room, keeping a heavy hand on the door and an even heavier eye on their pockets. By 3, we had a full set of cold souls shivering in the parlor, and I had a list of names that sounded like a social register of the city's least wanted. First was Sterling Vane, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of an ice block and then dressed in $5,000 worth of wool. He was the grandson of a shipping magnate, and if Julian's ledger was right, the Vane fortune was built on the redirected gold of a dozen looted treasuries. Sterling sat by the fireplace not because he was cold, but because he wanted to be near something he could control. He kept checking his platinum watch, with a rhythmic, nervous tick that told me he was more worried about time running out than the temperature. Next came Evelyn St. James. She was a woman in her late 60s with the posture of a retired general and a gaze that could peel paint. Her father had been a diplomat who apparently had a side hustle in black market antiquities. Evelyn wasn't here to plead, she was here to dictate terms. She sat on the edge of the sofa, her gloved hands folded over a silver-headed cane, looking at the brownstone as if it were a minor nuisance she intended to have demolished by morning. The third was Marcus Thorne, a banker whose firm specialized in private wealth management, which is usually code for keeping the taxman in the dark. Thorne was younger than the others, mid-40s, with a smile that was about as warm as a January puddle. He was the one who had tried to buy the ledger from Julian 2 weeks ago, and when that failed, he'd turned to more persuasive methods. He kept pacing the length of the rug, his eyes darting toward the stairs, looking for the man he'd chased through the drifts. Then there was Arthur Penhaligon, a retired judge whose reputation for integrity was apparently about to be hit by a landslide. He sat in the corner, his face a mask of weary resignation. Unlike the others, he didn't look angry, he looked exhausted. His family name was on law schools and libraries all over the East Coast, and the idea of that name being dragged through the slush of a Nazi-era accounting book was clearly more than his heart could handle. Finally, there was the man from the black sedan, who had traded his car for our entryway. He introduced himself as Halloway, a security consultant for the group. He was the muscle in the cashmere, a man with flat eyes and a neck that didn't believe in turning. He stood by the door, his presence a silent reminder that while Wolfe might own the house, Holloway and his employers intended to own the outcome. I went into the office to give Wolfe the scorecard. He was back in his chair, a glass of beer at his elbow, staring at the gold watch as if it were a crystal ball. "We have a full house," I said, leaning against his desk. "Sterling Vane, Evelyn St. James, Marcus Thorne and Judge Penhaligon, plus a watchdog named Halloway who looks like he eats gravel for breakfast. They all want to see Julian, and they all want to see that attaché case burned in the fireplace." Wolfe didn't look up. 5 souls, Archie. Each represents a different flavor of panic. Mr. Vane fears for his status, Mrs. St. James for her pride, Mr. Thorne for his ledger, and the judge for his soul. And Halloway? Mr. Halloway is merely a tool. He fears nothing but failure. It is the others who interest me. They have traveled through a blizzard to reach this sanctuary, which means their desperation has reached the point of ignition. They are not here to negotiate. They are here to suppress. Well, the judge looks like he's ready to jump out the window, I noted. Thorne is looking for the stairs, and the St. James woman is mentally measuring the office for a coffin. "What's the move? We can't keep them in the parlor forever. Fritz I. S. starting to complain about the traffic near the kitchen. Wolfe took a slow sip of beer, his eyes closing as he savored the malt. The move, Archie, is to let them simmer. Desperation, like a good stew, requires time to reach the proper consistency. Inform them that Mr. Vance is resting and will not be disturbed. Tell them I will see them at 6 o'clock, provided they remain civil. And Archie, his eyes open just a crack, keep a close watch on Mr. Thorne. A man who manages wealth often feels he has the right to manage the lives of those who threaten it. I went back to the parlor. The atmosphere had turned even colder. Sterling Vane was staring at Arthur Penhaligon with a look of pure loathing, and Evelyn St. James was tapping her cane against the floor in a slow, hypnotic beat. "Mr. Wolfe will see you at 6, I announced, pitching my voice to cut through the tension. "Until then, you are guests of the house. There's coffee in the urn, and I suggest you stay away from the stairs. Mr. Halloway, that goes for you too. This is a private residence, not a parking garage." Halloway didn't move, but Thorne stopped his pacing and looked at me with a sharp, hungry intensity. "We don't have until 6, Goodwin. This matter needs to be settled before the news cycle catches up with us. The only thing catching up with you right now is the snow," I told him. "Relax, Marcus. The ghosts aren't going anywhere. I left them there, a circle of suspects bound together by a ledger of old ins, and went back to the hall. The brownstone was silent, but it was the silence of a held breath. Upstairs, Julian Vance was hiding with his father's secrets. Downstairs, the beneficiaries of those secrets were sharpening their knives. It was 3:30. I had 2.5 hours to find out which of these cold souls was willing to kill to keep the past buried in the snow. I didn't stay in the parlor to watch the ice thicken between Sterling Vane and the judge. Instead, I headed to my desk in the office, but not before making a quick detour to the kitchen. I needed a reason to be moving around the house without looking like a watchdog, so I grabbed a fresh pot of coffee and a tray of Fritz's savory biscuits. Passing back through the parlor, I performed a little mental photography. Halloway was still a statue by the door. Evelyn St. James was staring into the fireplace as if she were waiting for her father's ghost to crawl out of the embers. Marcus Thorne was on his phone, his voice a low, frantic hiss that died the second I stepped into the room. Back at my desk, I got to work. Wolfe was upstairs with the orchids, which gave me exactly 40 minutes of privacy to use the telephone and my personal filing system. When you work for Nero Wolfe, you develop a Rolodex of people who know things they aren't supposed to, and a blizzard is the perfect time to catch them at home. I started with a contact at the Gazette who specializes in the kind of high society rot that Julian's L. Edger promised to expose. Within 20 minutes I had a sketch of the slush. Sterling Vane's shipping empire was currently taking on water, a major merger was on the horizon, and a scandal involving looted gold would sink the deal and the Vane aim faster than a lead anchor. Evelyn St. James had a grandson running for the Senate. She wasn't just protecting a memory, she was protecting a future. Marcus Thorne was the most interesting of the lot. His bank had recently been audited, and while the feds hadn't found the bodies yet, Julian's ledger was likely the map to the graveyard. As for Judge Penhaligon, his family trust was the primary donor for 6 charities that would vanish overnight if the source of their endowment was revealed to be the stolen life savings of displaced families. The motives were as clear as the ice on the windows, but the behavior was what bothered me. Why would they all come together? People with that much to lose usually don't travel in a pack unless they're afraid one of them is going to break ranks. I went back to the parlor to refresh the coffee. As I entered, I caught a sliver of a conversation. Marcus Thorne was leaning over Judge Penhaligon, his hand on the old man's shoulder in a way that looked less like comfort and more like a leash. "We agreed, Arthur," Thorne was saying, his voice sharp and cold. "Unity is the only way through this. If Vance talks to the papers, we all lose. If Wolfe gets that ledger, he'll turn us over to the DAJ. Us to see the expression on our faces." "I am tired of the lies, Marcus," the judge whispered. "Peter Vance was my friend. I should have spoken up 40 years ago. 40 years is too late for a conscience," Thorne snapped. He looked up and saw me, his face smoothing over into that polished banker's mask. "Mr. Goodwin, tell me, does Mr. Wolfe always take this long to reach a decision, or is he simply enjoying the spectacle of our discomfort? He's busy with his plants, I said, setting the pot down. Orchids don't care about mergers or Senate races. They just need the right temperature. I suggest you follow their lead and keep your cool. I walked toward the hallway, but instead of going back to the office, I took the service stairs up to the 3rd floor. I wanted to see how our guest was holding up. I found Julian Vance sitting on the edge of the bed in the south room, the attaché case still on his lap. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to breathe. "The vultures are downstairs," I told him, leaning against the doorframe. "Vane, St. James, Thorne, and the judge. They're forming a united front, but the judge looks like he's about to crack." "What's really in that ledger, Julian? Is it just names, or is there proof?" Vance looked up, his eyes hollow. "It's everything, Goodwin. Deposit slips from 1947. Transfers from dummy corporations in Panama. My father kept it because he couldn't bring himself to use it and couldn't bring himself to destroy it. He called it his, Inca of truth. Now it's just dragging me under. Why now? Why bring it to Wolfe today? Because Marcus Thorne sent Halloway to my apartment yesterday. They didn't just want the ledger, they wanted to make sure I disappeared with it. I realized then that as long as I had it, I was a dead man. I thought if I gave it to Wolfe, the responsibility, the target, would shift. "Generous of you," I remarked. "Wolfe doesn't like being a target, but he's even less fond of people who try to muscle him. Stay put. Don't open the door for anyone but me or Fritz." I went back downstairs, my mind racing. Thorne was the driver, the judge was the weak link, and Halloway was the trigger. But as I passed the hall closet, I noticed something that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. A faint, wet trail of slush led from the front door, not toward the parlor where the guests were, but toward the basement stairs. Someone had slipped out of the circle while I was upstairs. I checked the parlor. Thorne, Vane, and the St. James woman were there. The judge was still in his corner. But Halloway was missing from his post by the door. I didn't waste time. I headed for the basement, stairs, my hand sliding toward the holster under my coat. The blizzard was howling outside, but the real storm was moving through the guts of the house. Halloway wasn't just a watchdog. He was a scout, and he was looking for a way to get the ledger without waiting for Wolfe's permission. I reached the bottom of the basement stairs and found nothing but the hum of the furnace and the scent of Fritz's laundry soap. Halloway was gone. He was a professional, which meant he wasn't wandering aimlessly. He was either doubling back or he had found a secondary route. I took the back stairs up to the kitchen, moving as quietly as a man of my size can on old wood. I found Fritz at the center island, his jaw set in a line that usually meant he was about to declare war on a specific cut of meat. He didn't look up, but he pointed a paring knife toward the small pantry that housed the auxiliary cold storage and the dumbwaiter. The door was slightly ajar. I eased it open. The dumbwaiter shaft, which runs from the basement to the top floor, was humming. Someone had engaged the manual pulley. Halloway wasn't interested in the basement. He had used it to bypass the main hallway and the office, heading straight for the upper floors where the guest rooms and Julian Vance were located. I didn't wait for the dumbwaiter. I took the stairs 3 at a time, my heart hammering a rhythm that had nothing to do with the cold. By the time I reached the 3rd floor, I was moving on the balls of my feet. The hallway was dimly lit. The shadows stretched long by the grey afternoon light filtering through the frost. I saw Halloway. He was standing outside Julian Vance's door, his hand on the knob. He wasn't even trying to be quiet anymore. He had a heavy-duty master key in his palm, the kind that doesn't come from a local hardware store. "The south room is occupied, Halloway," I said, my voice echoing in the narrow corridor. "And I don't remember inviting you to the 3rd floor." He turned slowly. He didn't look surprised, just inconvenienced. He didn't reach for a weapon, which was smart, but he didn't move away from the door either. "Just checking on the client, Goodwin. We heard a noise. We thought he might be trying to leave. Mr. Vance is a guest, not a prisoner. Now, walk back to the parlor." I escorted him, but victory felt slim. When we reached the office, I found Wolfe standing by his desk, which was an event in itself. He was looking at the small cabinet where he keeps his current files. The drawer was open. More importantly, the gold watch, the one Peter Vance had left, was no longer on the desk. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "Theodore informs me that while you were chasing ghosts in the basement, someone entered this room through the plant room elevator." I felt a cold sinking in my gut. While Holloway was playing decoy on the stairs, someone else, someone who knew the house or had been watching the patterns, had used the secondary access. I looked at the suspects in the parlor. They were all there, looking exactly as I had left them, except for Marcus Thorne. He was standing by the window, adjusting his cufflinks with a smug, satisfied air. "The watch is gone, sir?" I asked, moving to the desk. "The watch is irrelevant," Wolfe snapped. "But the ledger, which I had placed in the bottom drawer for safekeeping, has been disturbed. It was not taken, but it was moved. The seal I placed on the binding has been broken." It was a subtle intrusion Wolfe takes as a personal declaration of war. Someone had touched his property, violated his filing system, and peered into a secret he was still weighing. It wasn't about the theft. It was about the arrogance of the act. "The dumbwaiter," I muttered. It wasn't just Holloway. Thorne must have slipped out the back of the parlor while I was in the kitchen talking to Fritz. He didn't go up. He went into the office while the coast was clear. Wolfe sat back, his bulk settling with a grim finality. He didn't look at Thorne. He didn't look at Holloway. He looked at me. "Archie, you were distracted by a shadow. While you watched the muscle, the mind was at work. Mr. Thorne believes that by glancing at the ledger he has regained control of the situation. He believes that because he now knows exactly which pages are most damaging, he can negotiate from a position of strength." "You want me to bounce him out into the snow?" "No," Wolfe said, his eyes narrowing to slits of black fire. "I want you to bring Julian Vance down here. And I want Saul Panzer. The weather is irrelevant now. If Mr. Thorne wishes to play at being a thief in my house, I shall ensure the price of his admission is more than he can afford." "The ledger has been read, Archie. That means the time for simmering is over. Now we boil." I went to the L to call Saul, my face burning with the sting of being outmaneuvered. Thorne had used the oldest trick in the book, the loud distraction and the quiet entry, and he had done it in the one house in New York where that sort of thing is supposed to be impossible. The trespass was a message. Thorne felt he was faster and smarter than the brownstone's defenses. As I dialed Saul's number, I looked through the doorway at Thorne. He caught my eye and offered a small, mocking toast with his empty coffee cup. He thought he'd won the first round. He had no idea that Nero Wolfe doesn't care about rounds, he only cares about the knockout. Saul answered on the second ring. "Saul," I said, "I don't care if you have to use a dog sled. Get here. We've had a visitor in the office and the boss is in a mood to break things." I hung up and headed for the stairs. The house was no longer a sanctuary, it was a cage, and the bars were beginning to glow red. The subtle trespass had turned a cold case into a hot one, and by the time I reached Julian's door, I knew that the blizzard outside was going to be the warmest thing about this evening. The blizzard had transformed from a weather event into a siege weapon, the wind rattling the heavy window panes of the office as if demanding entry. Saul Panzer arrived at 5:15, looking less like a man and more like a collection of frozen layers. He had bypassed the front door, slipping in through the service entrance after a harrowing trek from the subway. When he entered the office, his nose was red and his ears were tucked under a wool cap, but his eyes were as sharp as a pair of brand-new scalpels. "The snow is drifting 4 feet deep near the corner, Archie," Saul said, peeling off his gloves. "But the black sedan isn't the only thing watching the house. There's a second car, a grey coupe, parked near the alley. It belongs to a firm that does work for Marcus Thorne. They aren't just waiting for Vance, they're waiting for a signal." Wolfe, who had been sitting in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight, opened his eyes. "A signal, Saul. To what end?" "To retrieve whatever Thorne thinks he's already secured," Saul reported, taking the edge of the yellow chair. "I did some checking on my way through the drifts. Thorne's bank is on the verge of a federal freeze. He doesn't just need the ledger to hide the past, he needs it to blackmail the other three into a bailout. Vane, St. James, and the judge have the liquid capital he's missing. If he can prove their families' roles in the 1947 transfers, he can force them to float his bank or sink with him." I leaned against my desk, watching the door to the parlor. "So the united front is a sham. Thorne is the shark in the pool, and the other three are just trying to keep their heads above water. That explains why he risked the trespass. He didn't just want to see the names, he wanted to see the proof of the Panama transfers." Wolfe's fingers began their rhythmic drumming on the arm of his chair. This was the increased pressure he usually cultivated, but today it had arrived unbidden. "The signals, Saul. Did you observe any communication?" Thorne was at the parlor window when I slipped into the alley. He was using a flashlight. 3 short bursts toward the grey coupe. It happened right after Archie caught Halloway on the 3rd floor. I think Thorne realizes the quiet approach failed and he's ready to move to something more overt. The words were barely out of Saul's mouth when the doorbell rang again. This time, it wasn't a frantic pounding, it was the steady, rhythmic ring of authority. I went to the hall, checked the peephole, and saw a man in a city-issue overcoat with the unmistakable set of a precinct captain. Behind him, 2 uniformed officers were struggling against the wind. "It's the law, sir," I called back to the office, "and they don't look like they're here for a donation to the policeman's ball." I opened the door, and Captain Barrow of the 19th Precinct stepped in, shaking snow onto the rug. He looked at me with an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "Goodwin, we received a report of a kidnapping. A Julian Vance is allegedly being held here against his will by Nero Wolfe." "Kidnapping?" I laughed, though it felt a bit thin. "We've got a parlour full of people who walked in voluntarily to escape the storm. Mr. Vance is upstairs having a nap. Who made the report?" "An anonymous tip," Barrow said, stepping Earther into the hall. "But Mr. Marcus Thorne's office called the Commissioner directly to express concern for the judge's safety. I need to see Vance, now." Wolfe appeared in the office doorway, his bulk filling the frame. "Captain Barrow, you are a man of experience. Surely you recognize the scent of a strategic fabrication. Mr. Vance sought sanctuary here because he was being pursued by the very men who now claim he is a prisoner. As for the judge, he is in the parlour, quite free to leave if he wishes to brave the elements. I still need to see Vance, Wolfe. I have a duty to investigate the report." "Then you shall see him," Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute command. "But you will do so in my office, in the presence of those who accused me. Archie, bring the circle in, and bring Mr. Vance. If Mr. Thorne wishes to use the police as his personal retrieval service, he shall find that the service includes a full public accounting." The pressure had reached the breaking point. Thorne had signalled his outside team to call in the law, hoping the confusion of a police intervention would allow Halloway to snatch the attaché case in the shuffle. It was a bold move, the kind of move a man makes when he knows the ice is cracking under his feet. As I led the suspects from the parlour into the office, the atmosphere was lethal. Evelyn St. James looked at the police with a mixture of relief and disdain. Sterling Vane was ashen, and the judge looked as though he were re-walking to the gallows. Marcus Thorne, however, was radiant. He looked at Wolfe with the smug satisfaction of a man who had just played an ace. "Captain," Thorne said, stepping toward Barrow, "thank God you're here. We've been trying to convince Mr. Wolfe to release our associate for hours. This entire situation has been a nightmare of coercion." Julian Vance was the last to enter, escorted by Saul. He was still clutching the attaché case, his eyes wide with terror. He looked at the police, then at Thorne, and finally at Wolfe. "The signal has been answered," Wolfe murmured, settling back into his chair. "The stage is set, the audience is gathered, and the law is present. Mr. Thorne, you have been very busy with your flashlights and your anonymous tips, but you have forgotten one fundamental rule of this house. In the brownstone, the only signal that matters is the truth. Archie, lock the door. We are not yet finished with the snow, but we are quite finished with the lies." Saul moved to the door, his presence a silent barrier. Barrow looked at Wolfe, then at the attaché case, sensing he had been played into a much larger game than a simple kidnapping. The blizzard outside was nothing compared to the storm that was about to break inside the room. Thorne's signal had brought the police, but it had also brought the final confrontation. The office was now as crowded as a rush-hour subway car, but without the camaraderie. Captain Barrow stood by the globe, looking uncomfortable. While the 2 uniforms remained near the door, their presence providing a blue-tinted frame for the drama. Wolfe sat behind his desk, his bulk as immovable as the brownstone's foundation. He hadn't touched his beer in 10 minutes. His eyes were narrowed, tracking the movements of Marcus Thorne, who was currently the only person in the room who seemed to be enjoying the weather. "Mr. Thorne," Wolfe began, his voice a low, vibrating hum, "you have performed a remarkable series of maneuvers. You attempted to buy a ledger you did not own. When that failed, you attempted to seize it by force. When that was thwarted by a blizzard and Mr. Vance's instinct for survival, you entered my house and committed a trespass. And finally, you summoned the police to act as your unwitting accomplices in a theft. It is a dizzying itinerary of desperation." Thorne didn't flinch. He leaned against the edge of the heavy oak table, his expression one of polite concern. "Mr. Wolfe, your penchant for melodrama is well documented, but the facts are simpler. We are here to protect the interests of a group of distinguished citizens from a man who is clearly suffering a mental breakdown. Julian Vance has been babbling about ghosts and ledgers because he cannot accept his own financial failures. We called the police to ensure his safety. The ledger is real, Captain, Julian Vance shouted, his voice cracking. He held the attaché case tighter. It's right here. It proves how Thorne's bank was funded, with money that was supposed to be returned to the survivors of the war. My father's records don't lie." Wolfe raised a hand, and the room went silent. "The ledger is indeed real, Captain Barrow, and its reality is exactly why Mr. Thorne has been so energetic." He realized that if Julian Vance remained under my protection, the past would become the present. However, Mr. Thorne made a crucial assumption during his brief, unauthorized visit to this room earlier today. He assumed that because he saw certain names on certain pages, he had found the extent of the damage. I watched Thorne's face. For the first time, the smugness flickered. He looked at the bottom drawer of the desk, the one he'd pried into while I was busy with Halloway, and then back at Wolfe. "The frost is tightening, Mr. Thorne," Wolfe continued, his eyes locked on the banker. "You believe you saw proof of the Panama transfers involving Sterling Vane and Mrs. St. James. You believed that by securing that information you could blackmail your companions into saving your bank. That was your signal to the men in the grey coupe that the leverage was found. But you are a poor student of my methods. If I allow a predator to look into a drawer, it is because I have already decided what he is allowed to see." Sterling Vane rose, his face reddening. "Blackmail? Marcus, what is he talking about? You said we were here to protect the family names." "He was here to protect himself, Sterling," Evelyn St. James said, her voice like a whip. She hadn't moved from her chair, but her eyes were fixed on Thorne with a cold, predatory intelligence. "I've known Marcus since he was in short pants. He's always been better at spending money than making it. He wanted us to pay for his mistakes, using Julian's book as the invoice." Wolfe shifted his gaze to the judge, who was sitting with his head in his hands. "And you, Judge Penhaligon? You were the weak link in Mr. Thorne's chain. You were the only one among them with a conscience that hadn't been entirely frozen by greed. You knew what was in the ledger because Julian's father showed it to you years ago. You didn't come here to suppress the truth. You came here hoping I would find a way to let the truth out without destroying the charities you spent your life building." The judge looked up, his eyes wet. "I couldn't do it, Nero. I couldn't let him use it that way. Peter Vance wanted that money to go back to the families. Marcus just wanted to use it to fill a hole in his balance sheet." Thorne let out a short, harsh laugh. "This is a farce. Captain, are you going to listen to this senile old man and a private investigator who specializes in orchids? Vance is a thief. He stole that ledger from a private vault in Zurich. I demand he be taken into custody." "A thief?" Wolfe's voice rose, filling the office with a sudden, thunderous authority. "Mr. Thorne, the only theft that occurred today was the theft of the gold watch from my desk, an item you took to prove to your associates that you had successfully penetrated my defenses. But the watch was a lure. Inside the casing of that watch, which you so greedily snatched, was not a movement of gears and springs, but a highly sensitive piece of photographic film I had placed there an hour before your arrival. A film that, when developed by Mr. Panzer in the kitchen just 10 minutes ago, shows a very clear image of your hand reaching into my file drawer." Saul stepped forward, holding a damp, enlarged print. He showed it to Captain Barrow. Thorne's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled grey. The trap had closed. By trying to play the detective and the thief simultaneously, he had provided the one thing Nero Wolfe values above all else: undeniable proof of intent. "The police are here, Mr. Thorne," Wolfe said, his voice dropping back to a calm, deadly rumble. "But they are not here for Mr. Vance. They are here for the man who violated my house to protect a legacy of theft. The frost has not just tightened, it has set. Captain Barrow, I believe you have everything you need to begin your investigation into the anonymous report of kidnapping. It appears the only person being held against his will is Mr. Thorne, by the weight of his own arrogance." I moved to the door, my hand on the lock. The blizzard was still screaming outside, but inside the office, the air had finally cleared. Thorne was finished. The judge was broken, and the ghosts of 1947 were finally being given a voice. Wolfe reached for his beer, his fingers steady as he poured the golden liquid. The interrogation was over, the deconstruction had begun. The office had become a courtroom where the temperature was regulated by the ice in Nero Wolfe's eyes. Captain Barrow stood by the desk, the damp photograph held between two fingers as if it were a piece of radioactive waste. Marcus Thorne had retreated toward the globe, his back against the wall, his polished exterior finally cracking to reveal the raw, desperate nerves of a man who had bet his life on a bluff and lost. Sterling Vane and Evelyn St. James were silent, their expressions oscillating between a desire to flee and a terrified realization that they were tethered to Thorne's sinking ship. Wolfe leaned forward, his bulk casting a long, heavy shadow across the rug. "Be seated, everyone," he commanded. "The captain is a busy man, and I have no desire to spend the remainder of the night in the company of individuals who mistake my home for a marketplace. We shall now conduct a final audit of the Vance legacy." He turned his gaze to Julian Vance, who was still trembling by the red leather chair. "Mr. Vance, place the attaché case on my desk. It has served its purpose as a target, now let it serve as evidence." Julian obeyed, his hands shaking as he clicked the latches. He pulled out the ledger, a thick, leather-bound volume that smelled of old dust and Zurich bank vaults. Wolfe didn't touch it, he merely looked at it with the detached interest of a biologist studying a specimen. "The history of this book is a history of silence," Wolfe began, his voice dropping into that rhythmic, deliberate pace that signaled the end for his opponents. "For 40 years it sat in the dark. It contained the proof of how the Vane, St. James and Penhaligon fortunes were bolstered by the systematic diversion of displaced assets. But the most significant entry is not from the past, it is the one from 3 months ago. The entry Marcus Thorne attempted to find when he violated my desk." Thorne found his voice, though it sounded like it had been dragged through gravel. "I don't know what you're talking about. The book is decades old." "Is it?" Wolfe's eyes sharpened. "You are a banker, sir. You should know that a ledger is a living document until it is closed. Julian's father, Peter Vance, did not merely record the sins of his friends. He recorded the interest. He tracked the growth of those stolen funds into the modern era. He noted exactly how your father, and then you, used that shadow capital to leverage your way into the boards of half the financial institutions in this city. You weren't just protecting a memory, Mr. Thorne. You were protecting a current, active fraud." Wolfe shifted his attention to Captain Barrow. "Captain, the reason Mr. Thorne was so eager to see the ledger was not to destroy it. He wanted to verify if Peter Vance had recorded the account numbers for the Panama conduit. That conduit is the secret pipeline T. Horn has been using to drain the family trusts of his associates to cover the losses in his own bank. He hasn't just been hiding the past, he has been robbing the present." The room erupted. Sterling Vane let out a roar of betrayal, lunging toward Thorne before Saul Panzer's hand on his shoulder stopped him. Evelyn St. James stood up, her silver-headed cane trembling as she pointed it at the banker. "You've been stealing from the trust, Marcus," she hissed. "The trust my father built?" "Your father built it on blood, Evelyn," Thorne shouted, his face turning a dark, mottled purple. "I just kept it moving. If I go down, the Vane name goes with me. We're all in that book." "No," Wolfe thundered, his voice cutting through the noise like a broadsword. "You are not all in the book in the same way. Judge Penhaligon, you came here today because you realized that Thorne was using your family's history to coerce you into signing off on those fraudulent transfers. You were the only one among them who didn't want the money, you wanted the absolution. That is why you contacted Julian Vance and told him where the Zurich vault was located. You wanted the anchor of truth to drag Thorne to the bottom." The judge slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands. "I couldn't live with it any more, Nero. Peter told me before he died that the weight would eventually break us. I just didn't want it to break the children." Wolfe sat back, the bulk of him settling into the chair with a grim fin. "Ality. The deconstruction is complete. Mr. Thorne's kidnapping report was a desperate attempt to use the law to seize the proof of his modern thefts before I could connect them to the historical ones. He hoped that, in the confusion of a police raid, the ledger would be lost or secured by his own men. But he forgot that in this house, the only thing that gets lost is a lie." He looked at Captain Barrow. "Captain, The ledger contains the account numbers for the Panama conduit. I believe the district attorney will find it a fascinating read, particularly when compared to the audit records of Mr. Thorne's bank. I suggest you take Mr. Thorne and his security consultant into custody. The blizzard may have delayed the mail, but justice is being delivered on schedule. Barrow nodded, his face grim. He signaled to the two uniforms. As they moved toward Thorne and Holloway, the office felt strangely quiet despite the wind. The unity of the beneficiaries had dissolved into a bitter, cold reality. Thorne was led out first, his face a mask of ruined ambition. Holloway followed, silent as ever. I stood by the window and watched them being loaded into the squad cars. The black sedan and the grey coupe were already being hemmed in by the drifting snow, their occupants presumably realizing that the signal they were waiting for was never going to come. The sanctuary of the brownstone had been tested, trespassed, and triumphed. As the door closed on the law and the thieves, I turned back to the room. Wolfe was reaching for his beer, his fingers steady, his mind already beginning to drift back toward his orchids. The coldest room in the house was now the warmest, and the ghosts of 1947 had finally been laid to rest. The squad cars had pulled away into the white void of the storm, taking the noise and the crude ambition of Marcus Thorne with them. Sterling Vane and Evelyn St. James had departed shortly after, their exits marked by a stony, shattered silence that suggested they were already calculating the cost of the impending legal fees and the inevitable social evaporation. Only Julian Vance remained in the red leather chair, looking like a man who had survived a shipwreck, only to find the shore was made of glass. Judge Penhaligon sat near the window, his gaze fixed on the snow, his hands finally still. Wolfe reached for his beer, which had surely turned lukewarm by now, and poured it with a slow, deliberate hand. He took a sip, closed his eyes, and leaned back, his bulk settling into the chair with a sigh that seemed to echo through the entire house. "The thaw has begun, Archie," Wolfe murmured, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "But as with any spring, the melting snow reveals the debris we ignored during the frost." I leaned against my desk, looking at the ledger that still lay open under the desk lamp. "It reveals a lot, sir. Thorne's bank, the Panama conduit, the judge's conscience. But something is still rattling in the box. You said the gold watch was a lure, and the film Saul developed showed Thorne's hand in the drawer. But Saul didn't have time to develop film in 10 minutes in a kitchen during a police raid, not with the electricity flickering and Fritz breathing down his neck." Wolfe opened one eye and looked at me. "Your skepticism is as reliable as your appetite, Archie. You are quite right. The film Saul produced for Captain Barrow was indeed a fabrication, a blank strip of negatives he had treated with a bit of vinegar and developer to look authentic in a dimly lit room. I knew Barrow wouldn't examine it with a microscope in the heat of a kidnapping investigation, and I knew Thorne's guilt would do the rest of the work for us." Julian Vance looked up, his eyes widening. "You lied to the police? You tricked him into a confession?" "I provided Mr. Thorne with an opportunity to recognize his own reflection," Wolfe corrected him. He knew he had entered the room. He knew he had touched the drawer. When confronted with proof, his own memory became the prosecutor. However, that was not the deception I was referring to. "Archie, the watch." I picked up the heavy gold watch from the desk. It felt solid, an artifact of a more principled era. "What about it?" "Thorne took it, we got it back." "Open the back casing, Archie. Not the face, the inner plate." I took a pocket knife and eased the back cover open. Inside, nestled against the silent gears, was a small folded slip of paper, yellowed with age but preserved by the Ite seal of the gold. I unfolded it and read the 3 lines of cramped, elegant handwriting. My eyebrows went up so high they nearly hit my hairline. "It's a codicil," I said, my voice dropping. "Peter Vance didn't just leave a ledger of sins, he left a pardon. To the heirs of Penhaligon and St. James, the debt is recognized, but the interest is forgiven, provided the principal is returned to the relief fund of Zurich by the year 1990. Julian Vance rose, his face pale. "My father, he forgave them. He knew they would never pay it back on their own. He knew that a legacy of guilt is a poison that eventually kills the host," Wolfe stated, his voice devoid of sentiment. "He gave them 40 years to do the right thing. He didn't want to destroy the families, he wanted to save them from themselves. But Marcus Thorne's father, and then Marcus himself intercepted the correspondence. They realized that if the other families knew they were forgiven, Thorne would lose his leverage. He kept the secret of the pardon to ensure he could keep the conduit open. The judge turned from the window, his face illuminated by a sudden, fragile hope. Peter forgave us? He didn't want us in prison. He wanted you to be men of honor again, Arthur, Wolfe said. A status you chose to forfeit in favor of comfort. The tragedy is not that Thorne stole the money. The tragedy is that you allowed him to steal your peace when the door to your cage had been unlocked for decades. You were also Afra, aid of the ledger that you never looked for the key. I handed the slip of paper to the judge. He held it with trembling fingers, reading his old friend's words through a haze of tears. The thaw of deception was complete. The fraud wasn't just in the bank accounts, it was in the very nature of the fear Thorne had used to keep his circle in line. He had ruled them with a ghost that had long since been laid to rest by the man they feared most. "What happens now, sir?" I asked. "The police have the ledger. Thorne is going to talk to save his skin. The ledger remains a record of financial crime," Wolfe said, his eyes closing again. "Thorne will go to prison for his modern thefts, which are quite sufficient to keep him occupied for the remainder of his life. As for the past, the codicil provides the legal and moral framework for a restitution that does not require the destruction of the Penhaligon and St. James names, provided they act with the haste they should have shown in 1947. Julian, you are the executor of your father's true intent. I suggest you begin with the relief fund." Julian Vance took the attaché case, his posture finally straightening. He looked at Wolfe, then at the gold watch, and finally at the judge. "I think I'd like to stay in New York for a while, to see the snow melt." "Do as you wish," Wolfe grunted, "but do it quietly. I have had enough of the Vance family's dramatic timing to last me several lifetimes. Archie, show them out, and tell Fritz that the L.A. MB has been waiting 2 hours. If it is overdone, I shall hold Marcus Thorne personally responsible for that as well." I led both men to the hall. The blizzard was finally dying down, the wind a low moan rather than a scream. As I closed the heavy front door on the last of the snowbound guests, I felt the house settle back into its habitual, orderly silence. The ghosts had been paid, the lies had been developed, and the brownstone was once again a sanctuary. I headed for the kitchen, wondering if Fritz had any of that Zurich chocolate left. It felt like a night for it. The office was finally empty of everyone except the ghosts of the afternoon and the faint, lingering scent of damp wool and cold pipe tobacco. I spent 10 minutes doing the post-game cleanup, which involved emptying ashtrays that shouldn't have been used and returning the red leather chair to its proper angle of repose. The silence that had rushed back into the room was thick and heavy, the kind of silence that only follows a blizzard or a particularly loud confession. I looked over at Wolfe. He had relocated from his desk to the oversized chair by the bookshelf, a fresh glass of beer in his hand, and a volume of historical biography in his lap. He looked as settled as a mountain that had just finished shrugging off a minor landslide. "The judge and Julian are in a cab," I reported, leaning against the edge of my desk. "Or at least, they're in a vehicle that claims to be a cab. It's still a mess, but the plows are finally making a dent in 35th Street. Fritz says dinner will be on the table in 5 minutes. He's managed to salvage the lamb, though he's currently giving the oven a look that would wither like a cactus." Wolfe didn't look up from his book. "The lamb is a resilient meat, Archie, unlike the reputations of our late visitors. Did Mr. Vance take the watch?" "He took the watch and the codicil. He looked like he'd just had a 10-ton weight lifted off his chest. I think he's going to spend the night at the judge's place. They have a lot of catching up to do, most of it involving things they should have said 40 years ago. It's funny, sir. Thorne thought he was the master of the game because he knew the secrets, but he was the only one who didn't know the most important one. He was blackmailing people with a debt that had already been cancelled." Wolfe turned a page, the sound of the paper crisp in the quiet room, a common enough irony. "Men like Marcus Thorne do not believe in forgiveness, Archie. For them, debt is a permanent leash. They cannot conceive of a man like Peter Vance, a man who recognized that his own hands were not entirely clean and sought to wash them by offering a path to redemption for others. Thorne's failure was not one of intelligence, but of imagination. He saw only the ledger, he never looked for the heart. He looked for the watch, though, I reminded him. And that was his undoing. You knew he'd go for it. You knew his curiosity and his greed would get the better of his caution. It was a predictable trajectory, Wolfe murmured. A man who violates the sanctity of a home to peer into a private drawer is a man who has already conceded his moral standing. He believed that by touching my property, he was asserting his dominance over the situation. He did not realize that by touching the lure, he was merely confirming his own identity as a predator. The fake film was a flourish, yes, but it was a flourish necessitated by the crude nature of his own ambition. I went to the window and looked out. The snow was still falling, but the wind had died to a whisper. The streetlights were casting long, orange pools of light on the white drifts. For the first time all day, the city looked peaceful. The black sedan was gone, the grey coupe was gone, and the black market ghosts of 1947 had been traded in for a legal battle that would likely keep the newspapers busy until spring. What about the ledger? Barrow took it. Do you think the DA will actually go after the St. James and Vane families? Or will the codicil be enough to keep them out of the headlines? Wolfe closed his book, marking his place with a strip of silk. He looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. Restitution is a quiet business, Archie. Destruction is a loud one. The district attorney is a man who understands the value of a settled account. If the principal is returned to the families in Zurich, as Peter Vance intended, the Panama conduit will be closed. N.D. The modern frauds of Marcus Thorne will provide quite enough spectacle for the public's appetite. Justice, like a good meal, does not always require a flourish of trumpets. Sometimes it merely requires a clean slate. A clean slate of snow, I mused. It's a nice thought, though I doubt Sterling Vane is feeling particularly clean right now. He's probably wondering how he's going to explain a $20 million hole in his shipping merger. He will explain it with the truth, Wolfe said, rising from his chair with the slow, majestic effort of a planet shifting its orbit. A novel experience for him, no doubt, but truth has the benefit of being consistent. It does not require the constant maintenance of a lie. He moved toward the dining room, the scent of Fritz's roast lamb finally drifting in through the doorway. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at the office, at the desk where the gold watch had sat, and the chair where Julian Vance had shivered in his soggy cashmere. Archie, tell Fritz we shall require the 1929 Armagnac after dinner. A blizzard of this magnitude deserves a spirit of equal fire. And remind me to have the lock on that bottom drawer replaced. Mr. Thorne's touch has rendered it aesthetically offensive. I'll call the man tomorrow, I promised, and I'll make sure he isn't a cousin of anyone who works for a banker. I followed him into the dining room, where the candles were lit and the silver was gleaming. The brownstone was a sanctuary once more. The cold souls were gone, and the only thing left to settle was the matter of the lamb. As I pulled out my chair, I looked at Wolfe. He was already contemplating the first course with the same intensity he had applied to the Zurich ledger. The world outside was buried in white, but inside, the fire was bright, the beer was cold, and the truth was exactly where it belonged. Under Nero Wolfe's roof, you know, boss, I said as Fritz began to pour the wine. For a man who hates a draft, you did a pretty good job of clearing the air today. Wolfe offered a grunt that was almost a smile. Eat your soup, Archie. Snow will still be there in the morning. The lamb, however, will not.